The silent burden. The evening air was crisp as Trey Robinson trudged back through the small, desolate streets of his neighborhood. It was a quiet place, mostly empty homes with peeling paint and sagging porches, where no one had time for each other anymore. The only noise that filled the air was the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog from a nearby yard. But none of that seemed to matter to Trey. He had his own world, one that didn't include the noise or the laughter of children. As he walked, Trey's thoughts swirled around the heavy responsibility he carried. It wasn't the kind of burden any child should have to bear, this silent war he was fighting each day. On the outside, he might have looked like any other boy, small, slight, with wide eyes that hadn't yet lost the innocence of youth. But inside, Trey had aged far beyond his years. He had learned quickly that time wasn't a luxury you could afford when the weight of the world rested on your shoulders. He could feel the cool, rough fabric of the diapers pressing against his chest as he hugged them to him. The harshness of the plastic bag scraped against his skin, but it was the weight of the responsibility, not the physical load, that made his steps slow and heavy. Every day, it was the same. He would leave the house at the same time, visit the store to buy diapers, never toys or snacks like other kids, but diapers. He couldn't remember when it started, only that it had become part of his routine. A routine that had become his life. The store's bright, fluorescent lights seemed like a distant memory now, as if they were from a place he'd only visited in a dream. Trey knew that Mrs. Thompson's sympathy, her fleeting attempts to ask if he needed help, would always be there, but he couldn't accept it. He couldn't burden someone else with his pain, even if they wanted to help. It was easier, or at least it seemed easier, to just go through the motions and stay quiet. As he neared his house, the streets grew quieter, the homes more distant from one another. The Robinson family's house sat at the end of the block, an old wooden structure that had seen better days. The lawn was overgrown with weeds, and the porch sagged slightly under the weight of time. Trey had tried to fix it up at times, trimming the grass and sweeping the porch, but there was only so much a boy his age could do. His heart sank as he looked up at the house. It was always a bittersweet feeling, coming home but knowing what awaited him inside. The house was filled with memories of a time when things were better, when his mother had been healthy, vibrant, and full of life. Now, it was just a hollow shell of what it once was. He climbed the steps with a sense of resignation, pausing for a moment to catch his breath. It wasn't that the physical act of climbing the stairs was difficult, it was just the heaviness that followed him wherever he went. The thought that his mother, who used to be his protector, was now the one in need of protection. Trey unlocked the door slowly, as if trying not to disturb the fragile stillness that filled the house. Inside, the air smelled stale, the scent of sickness lingering in every corner. The once bright walls were now faded and yellowed, covered in marks from where furniture had been moved countless times. It was as if time itself had stopped in this house, frozen in place by the unspoken pain that lived within it. The first thing Trey did was check on his mother. He entered her room quietly, his small body slipping in through the doorway without making a sound. She lay there, in the same position as always, her thin body covered by an old, tattered blanket. Her breathing was shallow, ragged at times, but still steady. Trey's heart hurt to look at her. The woman who had once been the center of his world, laughing, dancing, singing, was now lost in a world of her own, trapped in a body that refused to cooperate. He set the diapers on the table beside the bed, careful not to disturb the few belongings they had. There was no sense of comfort here, only the cold reality that Trey was now the one providing for her, for them. He didn't complain, though. What good would complaining do? His mother had always told him that complaining was for the weak, and Trey had never felt weak, not even now. He had learned, through necessity, to be strong. He had to be strong, or who would take care of her? Trey leaned over his mother, gently brushing the hair from her forehead. Her skin was warm, feverish. She had been like this for weeks now, and Trey wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. He had tried everything, medicine, remedies from neighbors, calls to doctors, but nothing seemed to work. It was as if his mother was slipping away, slowly and quietly, without anyone noticing. But Trey noticed. Every day, he noticed. He had to notice. He couldn't afford to ignore the signs, couldn't afford to hope things would magically get better. There was no room for hope in a world like his. The boy sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know what to do anymore. He had done everything he could think of. Every day, he tried to make it better, ran the errands, bought the diapers, cleaned the house. He did it all without question, without complaint. But still, nothing changed. His mother remained motionless, her life slipping away in front of him. For a moment, Trey let himself feel the weight of it all. He didn't cry, though. He hadn't cried in months. There was no time for tears, not when there was so much work to do, so much he still needed to take care of. He had to be the adult. He had to carry the weight. His routine remained unchanged. After the diapers, it was the same every day. He'd start dinner, clean the house, check on his mother, and then repeat it all over again. The days blended together, indistinguishable from one another. He wasn't sure where his childhood ended and his adulthood began. He had crossed that line long ago, and now there was no turning back. But something was different today. Something felt off. Trey had no way of knowing it, but his actions had caught someone's attention. Officer Jackson Mitchell had been watching, though from a distance, ever since he'd first noticed the boy. The officer wasn't sure why it bothered him, why Trey's routine felt so wrong, but he couldn't ignore it. Something was stirring in his chest, something that told him he needed to follow the boy. As Trey finished his chores, he did so mechanically. The exhaustion that had settled in his bones never seemed to go away. He would sleep tonight, yes, but it would be another restless sleep, one filled with dreams of his mother and the fear of what might happen if he didn't do everything just right. Outside, the world kept turning, and Trey kept moving, his quiet footsteps echoing in the emptiness, with no one to notice, no one to care. He was alone, but at least he wasn't without purpose. Even if the rest of the world didn't see it, he was fighting a battle every day, one that no child should ever have to fight. The watchful eye. Officer Jackson Mitchell had always prided himself on his instincts. As a beat cop for nearly a decade, he had seen things that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. The highs and lows of humanity, the tragedy, the triumph, the despair, all of it passed through his hands like the pages of a book he couldn't quite close. But when it came to Trey Robinson, something about the boy didn't sit right with him. Trey was a quiet, solitary figure in a neighborhood that was anything but. Kids played in the streets, families gathered in their backyards, and life moved on as it always did. But not Trey. He was a ghost, slipping between the cracks of the community, unnoticed by most, but watched by a few. Mitchell had noticed him the first time he passed by, lugging a bag of diapers too large for his small frame. It wasn't the diapers that had caught his attention, though, it was the way Trey moved, the way he kept his head down and avoided eye contact with everyone around him. He was alone, and there was something about that solitude that gnawed at Mitchell's gut. Mitchell had watched him for a few days, following from a distance, trying to figure out what the boy was up to. He wasn't the kind of officer to interfere without cause, but there was something off about Trey's routine. Every other day, the boy would show up at Thompson's corner store, purchase diapers, and walk straight home. Nothing else. No signs of a happy childhood, no toys or games, just diapers. Mitchell wasn't sure why it bothered him so much. Maybe it was the fact that Trey seemed so young, yet so burdened. Maybe it was the way the boy's eyes, when they briefly met his, seemed to hide a secret, one that Mitchell wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. But what truly bothered him was how Trey seemed to be trapped in a loop, living a life far too mature for his age, doing things no child should have to do. So, on that evening, Mitchell decided to follow him. He had to know more. He had to understand why the boy was so isolated, why he was always buying diapers, and most importantly, what he was doing when he disappeared into the rundown house at the end of the block. It wasn't difficult to keep his distance. Trey was too focused on his task to notice anything out of the ordinary. The officer followed him from a few paces behind, staying just out of sight, careful not to draw attention. He watched as Trey's small figure made its way down the sidewalk, past the old buildings, past the kids laughing in the street, and finally toward the house at the end of the block. Mitchell's heart tightened as he watched the boy pause before the decrepit structure. The house was a far cry from the neat, well-kept homes he was used to seeing in the neighborhood. The paint had long since peeled away, the windows were cracked, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds. Mitchell could see the faintest flicker of light inside, but it was hardly enough to illuminate the house's crumbling facade. Trey stood at the front door for a moment, his back to the officer, as if hesitating before entering. Mitchell felt a pang of curiosity, followed by a growing sense of dread. What could a boy like Trey possibly be doing in a place like this? Was he staying here alone? Was he in danger? Mitchell's thoughts raced as he took a few cautious steps forward, trying to get a better view without being seen. He watched as Trey slowly turned the doorknob and stepped inside. The officer didn't move for a few moments. His instincts were telling him to stay put, to not make a scene, but his heart was pulling him in the opposite direction. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Not when he had a feeling, no, a certainty, that something was terribly wrong. He took a deep breath, scanning the area for any sign of movement before stepping cautiously toward the house. The creaky porch steps groaned beneath his weight, and Mitchell winced as the sound broke the silence of the street. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Trey's life, the one he was so desperately trying to protect, was unraveling behind those closed doors. Mitchell approached the window, careful not to make his presence known. The curtains were drawn, but through the small gap between them, he could make out the dim glow of a small lamp inside. It wasn't much, just enough to see the outline of a figure sitting by a bed. For a moment, Mitchell thought it was Trey, but then he realized the figure was much smaller, much frilier. It took a moment for him to recognize her, but when he did, his stomach dropped. It was Trey's mother. Mitchell had seen her around the neighborhood a few times, though he had never spoken to her directly. She wasn't the type to engage in small talk, but there was no mistaking the sickly pallor of her skin or the way her body seemed to sag against the bed, unmoving. His heart raced. There was no question now. Trey wasn't just running errands. He wasn't just trying to stay busy or avoiding the other kids. He was taking care of his mother. The woman lying in that bed was clearly ill, too ill to care for herself, let alone a child. Mitchell's mind began to race as the pieces fell into place. No wonder Trey had been so quiet, so isolated. No wonder he had been buying diapers for weeks without ever asking for help. It wasn't just a simple errand, it was survival. He was keeping things together, just barely, for the sake of his mother. And all of this was happening in a home that looked like it had been abandoned by the world long ago. Mitchell's chest tightened as he realized the depth of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just about a child doing chores. This was about a young boy carrying the weight of a world that should never have been his to carry. Trey wasn't just trying to hold it together for his mother, he was trying to hold it together for himself. Mitchell's thoughts swirled as he grappled with the stark reality of what was unfolding before him. Trey was alone. Truly alone. And his mother, despite being so close, was beyond his reach, locked in a fragile state of health that seemed to be deteriorating with every passing day. The officer stepped back from the window, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had just witnessed. He didn't know what to do next. He couldn't just barge in. He wasn't sure what kind of help was needed, or even if he could do anything to change the situation. But one thing was clear, Trey needed help. Officer Mitchell stood outside the house for a long while, the weight of what he had seen pressing heavily on his chest. He knew something had to be done, but the question was, what? And who would listen? Who could understand what this young boy was going through? As the sky darkened, Mitchell made the difficult decision to leave, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered a secret that would change everything. Trey wasn't just a boy trying to survive. He was fighting a battle no one could see, and Mitchell had no idea how to help him. Unraveling the truth. Officer Jackson Mitchell didn't sleep that night. He sat in his small apartment, his eyes tracing the same patterns across the walls as his mind spun. The image of Trey Robinson's face, so small, so vulnerable, kept haunting him. What kind of life was this child living? And how had things gotten so far out of control? Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing only a fraction of the story. There was more to it, something deeper, darker, and more painful than what he had witnessed on that quiet evening. Mitchell had seen his share of hardship in the years he had been on the force, but this was different. This wasn't just another case of neglect or a broken home. This was something that hit far too close to the core of what he believed about the world. The idea that a child like Trey, barely a teenager, if that, was carrying the burden of an entire household, all alone, was beyond comprehension. He ran through the possibilities in his mind, but none of them seemed to fit. How had things come to this point? Why had no one noticed before? And, more importantly, what could he do to make it right? The next morning, Mitchell woke up early, still unsettled by the night's thoughts. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just sit by and pretend that nothing had happened. He needed to check in on Trey, make sure that the boy was all right and figure out what could be done to help. He dressed quickly and grabbed his keys, but as he walked out the door, something stopped him. He wasn't sure what it was, but he had a nagging feeling that he wasn't ready to face Trey yet. He didn't know if he could. He was a cop, sure, but that didn't mean he knew how to help a child who was so far beyond his years in terms of pain and responsibility. The officer took a deep breath, pushing down his unease. There was no turning back now. He had to get to the bottom of it, and if that meant confronting his own fears and weaknesses, so be it. Mitchell parked his squad car a few blocks away, careful not to draw attention to himself. He didn't want to scare Trey, or worse, make him feel like he was a subject of an investigation. As he walked down the street, he kept his eyes on the ground, trying to appear inconspicuous. He didn't want anyone to think that something was wrong, especially Trey. When Mitchell arrived at the Robinson house, his heart sank. There was no sign of life from the outside, no movement in the windows, and no sound of the normal hustle and bustle of a family home. It was eerily silent. He knocked on the door softly, hesitating for a moment before doing so. His mind raced with all the things he might say. He could introduce himself as a concerned neighbor, a cop just checking in on things. He could pretend that he didn't already know the truth. But deep down, Mitchell knew he wasn't fooling anyone. He had already seen too much. He had already witnessed the desperation in Trey's eyes. The door creaked open slowly. Trey stood there, eyes wide, his face pale, but there was no surprise in his expression. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to notice him. For someone to see the quiet struggle he was facing every day. "Hello, Trey," Mitchell said, his voice softer than he had intended. He didn't know how to begin. Trey didn't answer right away, his gaze flicking to the ground, as though he were deciding whether or not to speak. Finally, he looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Officer Mitchell. What are you doing here?" Mitchell swallowed hard. "I just wanted to check in on you. I noticed you've been coming into the store a lot, buying diapers. I wanted to make sure everything was okay." Trey's eyes darted nervously around, and Mitchell saw the familiar unease in the boy's face. It was the same look he had seen in countless children who knew their lives weren't normal, but couldn't quite explain why. Trey's hands fidgeted, his fingers gripping the edge of the door so tightly that his knuckles went white. "I'm fine," Trey said, his voice lacking conviction. "Everything's fine. You don't need to worry about me." Mitchell knew better than to take that at face value. He had been around enough children to know when they were lying, and this was one of those times. He could see the fear in Trey's eyes, the way his whole body seemed to shrink back from the world. It wasn't just a case of a shy, quiet kid, it was something deeper. Something he was too afraid to say out loud. "Trey," Mitchell said gently, "I'm not here to get you in trouble. I just want to help." The boy's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Mitchell thought he might say something. But then, as quickly as the flicker had appeared, it was gone. Trey stepped back from the door and began to close it. "Please don't," Mitchell said, his voice firm but not forceful. He wasn't going to let the boy shut him out, not this time. "I know you're scared. I get it. But you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Trey froze, his fingers trembling on the door. "I don't want to burden anyone," he muttered, almost to himself. Mitchell took a step forward, his heart aching as he realized the depth of what was happening here. This wasn't just about a sick mother or a broken home. This was about a child who had convinced himself that asking for help was too much. A child who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for so long that he didn't know how to put it down. "You're not a burden," Mitchell said softly, reaching out a hand as if to bridge the gap between them. "You don't have to protect everyone by yourself, Trey. It's okay to need help. It's okay to be a kid." For the first time, Trey's face softened. His shoulders trembled, and Mitchell could see the tears that were threatening to spill from his eyes. Trey bit his lip, trying to hold it together, but it was clear that the dam was close to breaking. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Trey spoke. "She's sick, my mom. She doesn't get better. I've tried everything. I don't know what to do. I'm so scared, Officer Mitchell." The words tumbled out like a flood, a confession he had kept hidden for so long. For all the times he had pushed his emotions down and tried to pretend everything was fine, it wasn't fine. And now, standing in front of someone who seemed to care, Trey couldn't hold it back any longer. Mitchell's heart broke for the boy. He could see the rawness of Trey's pain, the years of fear and loneliness that had weighed him down. In that moment, he knew that this wasn't just about taking care of his mother, it was about surviving a life that wasn't fair, a life that no child should ever have to endure. The officer stepped forward, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out, Trey. You're not alone anymore." The breaking point. The words hung in the air between them, a lifeline that Trey desperately needed but had never known how to reach for. Mitchell's heart ached as he watched the boy, whose shoulders were still tense, his eyes now filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For the first time, Trey didn't look like he was trying to carry the weight of the world alone. There was a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that something could change, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he had convinced himself. But Mitchell knew that things wouldn't change overnight. The boy had endured too much, built up too many walls, and it would take more than a kind word to undo the damage of years spent in isolation. Still, this was the beginning. And that had to be enough, for now. "I don't want to talk about it." "I can't," Trey whispered, his voice breaking as if the very act of speaking about it was too much to bear. His hands trembled at his sides, and Mitchell could see the effort it took for the boy to even stand there, to face him. The walls he had built were thick, and breaking them would take time. "I understand," Mitchell said gently. "You don't have to tell me everything now. But I'm here, Trey. If you need someone to talk to, if you need help, any kind of help, I'll be here." Trey nodded stiffly but didn't say anything more. He glanced back over his shoulder, as though he were making sure no one else was listening, his gaze shifting nervously between the officer and the dark interior of the house behind him. Mitchell could see the hesitation in Trey's eyes, the uncertainty of whether he could truly trust anyone. He was so used to taking on everything alone, to being the adult in a child's body, that the idea of sharing his burden with someone else was almost impossible to fathom. "I'm not going anywhere," Mitchell reassured him. "But I'll give you some space. I just want you to know, you don't have to go through this by yourself." Trey finally let the door close with a soft click, his eyes lingering on the officer for a moment longer, as though weighing the sincerity in Mitchell's voice. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the house, leaving Mitchell standing on the cracked porch, staring at the rotting wood that seemed to swallow up the boy's presence like it had swallowed so much else. Mitchell took a deep breath and turned to leave, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he walked back to his car, the weight of Trey's words, the uncertainty, lingered in his chest. He couldn't just let this go. Trey had opened a door, a small crack, but a door nonetheless. And Mitchell was going to keep pushing until that door was fully opened. The days that followed were a blur of quiet observation and unanswered questions. Mitchell continued to monitor the house, making regular rounds to check in, but he didn't push. He knew Trey needed time to process everything. The boy was still holding on to his old habits, still trying to be the caretaker, still too proud, or too afraid, to accept help. And Mitchell knew that, at this moment, all he could do was give Trey the space to decide for himself what he was ready to face. But Mitchell wasn't just waiting. He reached out to local social services, connecting with the right people who could help provide support for Trey and his mother. There were specialists who could assess the mother's condition and perhaps provide care or assistance. He also reached out to a few local community groups, hoping to find someone who could help bridge the gap between the boy's broken world and the people who were ready to help. It wasn't enough, though, not yet. And Mitchell knew that time was running out. One evening, a few days later, Mitchell found himself parked outside the Robinson house again. It was late, the sky a dark purple as the streetlights cast long shadows across the empty pavement. Something felt different this time. He wasn't sure if it was the eerie stillness of the neighborhood or the quiet that had settled in the air, but there was an undeniable sense that tonight could be the night he finally got through to Trey, or that things could take a turn for the worse. As he stepped out of his car, Mitchell looked up at the window of the Robinson house. There was a dim light flickering inside, casting a soft glow through the cracked curtains. His heart beat faster, a surge of worry rising in his chest. He didn't know why, but he felt an urgency he couldn't explain. He approached the porch once again, this time with a different feeling in his stomach, unease. When he reached the door, his hand hovered over the doorbell, and he hesitated. There was something in the air tonight, something heavy. Before he could press it, the door opened slightly, and Trey's face appeared in the crack. "Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You can't keep coming here. I told you, I'm fine." Mitchell looked at the boy, who looked smaller than usual. His eyes were wide with fear, and there was a desperation in his posture that wasn't there before. It was like a dam had broken inside of him, and the flood of emotions had nowhere to go but out. "I'm not leaving," Mitchell said softly. "Not until I know you're okay." Trey swallowed, his lips trembling as if he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped aside, and Mitchell, without a word, walked into the house. The air inside the Robinson house was thick with the scent of illness. There was an oppressive heaviness in the air, the kind that only comes when a house is filled with too many unsaid things. It felt like the walls themselves were suffocating. Trey led Mitchell into a small living room, and there, lying on an old couch, was his mother. The woman looked like a shell of herself. Her skin was pale, her body frail, barely able to support her weight as she lay motionless under a thin blanket. Her shallow breathing was the only sound that filled the room, a constant reminder of the battle she was fighting, and the battle Trey was waging on her behalf. "Mom, is she going to be okay?" Mitchell asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Trey shook his head, a single tear escaping his eye as he looked at his mother. "I don't know. She's been getting worse. I'm trying, but I can't do it by myself." Mitchell sat down beside the boy, his hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was enough. Mitchell knew that the real battle wasn't just about the mother's illness, it was about the boy, too. He wasn't just trying to keep her alive, he was trying to survive a life that had been shattered beyond recognition. "I'm not going to leave you alone," Mitchell said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. "We'll get her the help she needs. And we'll get you the help you need, too." Trey finally looked up at him, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that shattered any remaining walls. "I don't want to be alone anymore," he whispered. Mitchell felt a lump form in his throat. "You don't have to be." Shattered worlds. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and visits to social services. Officer Mitchell was relentless in his pursuit to get Trey the help he needed, but even with his best efforts, it felt like the boy's world remained just out of reach, too far gone for anyone to fix. It wasn't just the mother's illness, it was everything else that had been neglected. Trey had been left to carry far too many burdens for too long, and the cracks in his fragile life were too deep to repair quickly. Mitchell found himself spending more time with Trey, even after he had filed the necessary reports. He would drop by the house in the mornings, after his shift, bringing over groceries or even just sitting with the boy. Trey was still hesitant, still wary of Mitchell's kindness, but he was slowly starting to trust him. The officer had earned a sliver of his trust, and that was enough for now. Trey's mother, Evelyn, hadn't improved. The medical professionals had confirmed that she was in the final stages of her illness, an aggressive form of cancer that had spread rapidly through her body. The doctors were blunt about her prognosis, there wasn't much they could do. And so, as much as Trey had tried to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, it was becoming clear that there was nothing left to hold on to. His mother was slipping away, piece by piece, and with her, the last thread of stability that Trey had ever known. But what hurt the most was not just watching his mother suffer, it was the helplessness in her eyes. Trey could see it every time she looked at him, the guilt and the sorrow, as if she were apologizing for the burden she had placed on him. He wasn't supposed to be the one looking after her, and she knew it. One afternoon, as Mitchell sat with Trey on the worn couch in the living room, Evelyn's rasping breaths echoed in the silence. The television flickered in the background, but neither of them paid attention to it. It was just noise now, just a distraction from the reality they were living. Trey's eyes never left the floor, his fingers tightly clutching the hem of his t-shirt. It was as though he was trying to hold himself together, trying to prevent the flood of emotions from breaking free. Mitchell watched him, a heavy silence settling over them. There was only so much he could do. The medical help was in place, Trey's mother was receiving hospice care, but it wasn't enough. Nothing could truly prepare anyone for the loss they were facing. Trey was losing his mother, but he was also losing everything he had known about family, about safety. His world had been so small for so long, and it was about to get even smaller. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Trey spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do anymore, Officer Mitchell. I just want it to stop. I just want it to stop hurting." The words hit Mitchell like a punch to the gut. He had seen his share of pain in his years on the force, but this was different. This wasn't just a kid facing hardship, it was a child who had been robbed of his innocence. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that Trey had been forced to carry, had worn him down to nothing. And now, with his mother slipping away, it was as though the last bit of hope had been extinguished. "You don't have to do this alone," Mitchell said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it feels like everything is falling apart, but I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to face this on your own." Trey's eyes darted to the officer, his expression torn between hope and disbelief. It was the same look he had given him the first time they spoke, the look of a child who wasn't sure if he could trust the kindness of others. But this time, there was something different. There was a flicker of relief in Trey's eyes, as though he had finally realized that maybe, just maybe, someone cared. But even that was fleeting. Trey stood up abruptly, his hands shaking. I can't do this. I can't keep watching her like this. I can't keep pretending everything is fine. Mitchell rose to his feet, moving quickly to steady the boy, who was suddenly overcome with emotion. Trey's face crumpled, and before Mitchell could stop him, the boy was on the floor, his knees buckling beneath him. The tears that had been building up for so long came rushing out, and Trey finally let go of everything he had been holding in. I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose her. Trey sobbed, his small frame shaking with each ragged breath. The walls that Trey had built to protect himself from the world were gone, leaving only raw vulnerability. It was the cry of a child who had been forced to grow up too soon, a cry of someone who was not ready to face the darkness that had come into his life. Mitchell knelt beside him, placing a hand on Trey's back, offering what comfort he could. The officer knew that there was nothing he could say to make it better, nothing that could erase the pain the boy was feeling. But he also knew that the most important thing was to be there, to stand with him in that moment. You don't have to have all the answers, Trey. You don't have to carry it all by yourself, Mitchell said, his voice barely a whisper. We'll figure this out together. You're not alone in this. I promise. Trey's sobs slowly quieted, though the boy's body still trembled with the weight of everything he had been holding back. The flood of emotions had finally started to subside, but the damage was done. His world had been shattered in so many ways, and he wasn't sure how to begin picking up the pieces. Thank you, Trey whispered, his voice raw. Thank you for not leaving me alone. Mitchell gave him a sad smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're welcome. But you have to know, Trey, you're not alone anymore. You've got people who care about you. We're going to get through this, together. But as much as Mitchell tried to reassure the boy, there was still a gnawing fear in his chest. Time was running out for Evelyn. And while they had made progress, Mitchell knew that this wasn't going to have a happy ending. There were no easy solutions to this kind of pain. But he wouldn't give up on Trey. He couldn't. The officer stood up, offering a hand to Trey, who took it slowly, still unsure of everything but thankful for the support. They stood there together in the dimly lit living room, two people who were trying to make sense of a world that made no sense at all. Trey didn't have to face it alone anymore. And neither did Mitchell. The battle was far from over, but maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. A glimmer of hope. The morning after the storm of emotion, Trey woke up to a sense of exhaustion that felt almost unbearable. His eyes were swollen, and his head throbbed with the remnants of the night's turmoil. His body felt heavy, as though every part of him had been drained of strength, yet somehow, there was a faint flicker of something new, a shift in his heart that he couldn't quite understand. He had cried, something he hadn't done in years, and now, as he sat in the quiet stillness of the living room, he felt the weight of everything settle on him again. But this time, it was different. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. He had shared his pain, let someone in, and the world hadn't fallen apart. Trey was still scared, scared of losing his mother, scared of not being able to take care of her, scared of not being enough. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to breathe, just a little. He glanced over at his mother, who was still lying in the same position on the couch. Her chest rose and fell slowly, and although her face remained pale and drawn, there was a faint trace of peace in her expression. Even as she drifted in and out of consciousness, there was a comfort in knowing she wasn't alone, that someone was there beside her, keeping watch. Trey walked slowly over to her side, his fingers brushing the back of her hand. He didn't know how much longer they had. But as he looked at her, he promised himself that he would be strong, that he would do whatever it took to make her comfortable, to make sure she knew she wasn't forgotten. The sound of the doorbell ringing pulled him out of his thoughts. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at his mother, and then made his way to the door. When he opened it, Mitchell stood there, a warm smile on his face. There was something different about the officer today, something softer, less guarded. "Hey, Trey," Mitchell said gently, taking in the boy's expression. He could see the lingering sadness in Trey's eyes, but there was a spark of hope there, too. It was small, but it was there. Trey didn't know what to say. He had grown accustomed to the silence that often hung between them, the space that needed to be filled with words that neither of them knew how to say. But today, something felt different. "Hey, Officer Mitchell," Trey said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped aside to let the officer in, and as Mitchell walked into the room, Trey felt that same warmth he had come to rely on. "How's she doing?" Mitchell asked, nodding toward Evelyn. Trey sighed, looking at his mother with a mix of love and sorrow. She's still here. But I don't know how much longer." Mitchell's expression softened, and he knelt down beside Trey, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "You've been doing an amazing job, Trey. I know it feels impossible right now, but you're not alone in this. You've got people around you who care." Trey swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to believe those words. He wanted to believe that the officer's kindness wasn't just a fleeting gesture, that it wasn't just pity. But there was a part of him that still struggled to accept help, still struggled to trust anyone enough to let them in. "I don't know what to do," Trey confessed, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to make her better. I don't know how to make everything stop hurting." Mitchell's heart broke for the boy. He had seen enough of the world's darkness to know how it could crush someone's spirit, but Trey's innocence, his hope, had been shattered too early. He shouldn't have had to carry this burden. "I don't have all the answers, Trey," Mitchell said, his voice gentle. "But I do know this, you've done everything you can. You've been strong for her when no one else was. And that counts for something." Trey looked up at him, his eyes searching the officer's face for some hint of reassurance, some sign that things would get better. But Mitchell didn't promise him an easy fix. He knew better than that. Life wasn't something that could be easily mended with kind words or quick solutions. But sometimes, the act of being present, of showing up for someone in their darkest moments, was the most important thing you could do. "You don't have to carry this on your own anymore," Mitchell continued, his voice steady. "You're not alone, Trey. I'm here for you, and there are people in this community who want to help you. It's okay to let them." Trey didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at the officer with an expression that was hard to read. For a moment, Mitchell wondered if he had said too much, if he was pushing the boy too hard. But then, to his surprise, Trey nodded, his lips trembling as he took a slow breath. "Thank you," Trey whispered, his voice barely audible. Mitchell smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me. You're a good kid, Trey. I'm just glad to help." For a few moments, there was only silence between them, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence it had been before. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the knowledge that sometimes, there were no words to fix what had been broken. All they had was each other, and that had to be enough. As the days passed, the weight of their situation didn't lessen, but something in Trey began to shift. The small, steady presence of Officer Mitchell, the care and concern of the people in their community, slowly started to make a difference. The boy who had once been so closed off, so afraid to let anyone see the cracks in his armor, began to open up. It wasn't a quick process, but it was progress. And although the shadow of death still loomed over the Robinson family, there was a sense of calm that had settled over them. Trey had found a small piece of peace within the chaos, something that he could hold on to as he faced the days ahead. He was no longer alone in this fight. It wasn't a happy ending, not by any means. The truth was, there was no perfect resolution to the story of Trey and his mother. There would be no easy answers or miraculous changes. But there was something far more powerful, a glimmer of hope, a promise that even in the darkest of times, someone would always be there, ready to help, ready to listen. And sometimes, that's all a person really needs to begin to heal.